Welcome, Dark Night Tales. Tonight's story takes us back to 1912, to the cold, unforgiving night the Titanic vanished beneath the Atlantic. Among the thousands of names lost to history was Joseph, the only black man aboard the ship, whose voice was silenced for decades. His truth didn't surface until 83 years later, buried under fear, racism, and forgotten records. This is not a myth. This story is built on careful research, verified sources, and relentless digging for the truth. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value real history uncovered with effort and honesty, subscribe, because stories like this take countless hours of true dating to bring into the light. In April 1912, the RMS Titanic set sail on what was meant to be a triumphant maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. Celebrated as the largest and most luxurious ship ever built, the Titanic symbolized human confidence in technology and progress. Newspapers called it unsinkable, a floating palace divided by rigid social classes, first, second, and third, each separated not just by walls, but by privilege. On board were over 200 passengers and crew, carrying dreams of wealth, survival, and new beginnings. But beneath the elegance and optimism, danger quietly followed. Warnings of icebergs were received repeatedly on April 14, yet they were ignored or downplayed to maintain speed and prestige. That night, in the freezing North Atlantic, the Titanic struck an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. The damage was catastrophic but slow, giving passengers a false sense of safety as the ship began to flood compartment by compartment. Lifeboats were launched half empty. Chaos spread unevenly through the decks, and class divisions determined who lived and who did not. By 20:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the Titanic broke apart and disappeared beneath the ocean, leaving more than 500 people dead in icy darkness. The tragedy shocked the world, exposed the arrogance of so-called invincibility, and forever changed maritime law. Yet within this well-documented disaster, some stories, especially those of marginalized individuals, were erased, ignored, or deliberately forgotten. Joseph's presence on that final voyage existed in this shadowed space, where history remembered the ship, but not all the souls who sailed on it. Joseph remains one of the most mysterious figures connected to the Titanic, largely because official records from the early 20th century often ignored or minimized the identities of black individuals. What is known comes from fragmented documents, later testimonies, and historical reevaluations conducted decades after the disaster. Joseph was a black man traveling alone in 1912, at a time when racial discrimination was deeply embedded in society on both sides of the Atlantic. His very presence aboard the Titanic was unusual and, to many, inconvenient to record accurately. Unlike wealthy passengers whose lives were carefully documented, Joseph's background was reduced to brief, vague references or omitted entirely. He is believed to have been traveling for work opportunities, possibly as a laborer or service worker, reflecting a common reality for black men of that era who sought better futures despite systemic barriers. His name appeared inconsistently in records, sometimes misspelled, sometimes replaced with generic labels, making it difficult for historians to trace his origins or confirm personal details. What makes Joseph's identity so powerful is not just who he was, but how history treated him. While passengers of higher social and racial status were immortalized in photographs, newspapers, and memorials, Joseph existed on the margins of memory. His story challenges the completeness of Titanic history and exposes how racism shaped which lives were considered worth remembering. It was only decades later, when historians began re-examining overlooked testimonies and questioning official narratives, that Joseph's existence was acknowledged, restoring a name to someone history had tried to erase. In 1912, racial segregation was an unspoken but powerful reality, and the Titanic, despite its reputation for luxury and modernity, was no exception. As the only black man aboard, Joseph lived in near total racial isolation from the moment he stepped onto the ship. Surrounded by thousands of passengers and crew, he had no community that reflected him, no shared space of familiarity, and no protection from the silent judgments of a deeply divided society. Social class already dictated where a person could walk, eat, or sleep on the Titanic, but race added another invisible barrier. Even if Joseph followed every rule, paid his fare, and respected the ship's hierarchy, he remained visibly other. Conversations grew shorter around him. Doors closed more quickly. His movements were noticed in ways others were not. This isolation meant fewer witnesses to remember him later, fewer people willing to speak his name after the tragedy, and fewer records acknowledging his presence. During the chaos of the sinking, this racial isolation became even more dangerous. Survival often depended on who was seen, who was heard, and who was believed. In a disaster where class and gender already decided fate, race further reduced Joseph's chances of assistance or recognition. After the ship went down, this same isolation followed him into history, his experience drowned beneath louder, more socially accepted narratives. Joseph's racial isolation aboard the Titanic explains not only how alone he was in life on that ship, but why his story remained buried for more than 8 decades. On the Titanic, a person's value was often measured by their class ticket, and class dictated almost every aspect of life aboard the ship. Where you slept, what you ate, and even your chances of survival. Joseph's role and class status placed him at the very bottom of this rigid hierarchy. Unlike first-class passengers whose names filled newspapers, Joseph existed in the shadows of the ship's social structure, where individuals were seen more as labor than lives. Historical fragments suggest Joseph was not traveling as a wealthy guest, but as a working man, possibly connected to service or manual labor, roles commonly assigned to black men during that era. These positions came with little visibility and even less respect. Crew members and lower-class passengers were expected to obey orders silently, move through restricted areas only when permitted, and remain unseen by those above them. Joseph's status meant he had no influence, no powerful connections, and no advocate when chaos erupted. When the disaster unfolded, class became a death sentence. First-class passengers were guided toward lifeboats, while those in lower classes faced locked gates, confusing orders, and delayed warnings. For someone like Joseph, his class status, combined with racial prejudice, created an almost impossible barrier to survival. Even if he followed instructions perfectly, he would have been among the last to receive help and the first to be forgotten. This harsh reality explains why his name nearly vanished from official records. History preserved the powerful, while men like Joseph were reduced to silence. The night of April 14, 1912, began quietly, almost peacefully. The ocean was calm, the sky was clear, and most passengers aboard the Titanic were unaware they were sailing straight into danger. When the ship struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., the impact felt minor to many, just a shudder, a brief vibration beneath their feet. But below the waterline, the damage was already fatal. For Joseph, this moment marked the beginning of a nightmare shaped by confusion, fear, and invisibility. As alarms spread and orders echoed through the ship, chaos unfolded unevenly. First-class passengers were gently awakened and reassured, while those in lower classes received delayed or unclear information. Joseph, confined by both class and racial barriers, would have had limited access to accurate instructions. Corridors filled with rushing water, Crew members shouted conflicting commands, and locked gates turned escape routes into dead ends. In that darkness, survival depended not just on strength, but on proximity to power. The lifeboats told the crewless story. Many were launched half-empty, reserved by custom and prejudice for women and children of higher classes. A man like Joseph, alone, black, and lower class, stood little chance of being prioritized. As the ship tilted and the cold intensified, the reality became unavoidable. The Titanic was dying. When it finally broke apart and vanished into the Atlantic at 20 a.m., Joseph's fate disappeared with it, unseen, unrecorded, and unheard, just like his story would be for decades to come. In the aftermath of the Titanic disaster, survival was not the end of the suffering. It was often the beginning of a different kind of torment. For Joseph, surviving the sinking did not mean freedom or relief. It meant carrying a truth that the world was unwilling to hear. At a time when black voices were routinely dismissed or punished, speaking openly about what he witnessed aboard the Titanic came with real danger. Silence became a form of protection. Racial prejudice in the early 20th century shaped whose testimonies were believed and whose were ignored. Survivors from privileged bounds were interviewed, quoted in newspapers, and invited to tell their stories. Joseph, by contrast, faced a society where a black man's account could be doubted, ridiculed, or erased entirely. Fear of retaliation, public hostility, or professional ruin likely forced him to remain quiet, allowing official narratives to form without his voice. This silence lasted decades. While the Titanic became one of the most documented tragedies in history, Joseph's experience remained hidden, locked behind fear and systemic exclusion. His survival was never celebrated, and his trauma was never acknowledged. Only many years later, when historians began re-examining overlooked records and questioning whose stories had been left out, did Joseph's voice begin to emerge. His long silence was not forgetfulness, it was survival in a world that made truth dangerous. Joseph's story did not vanish by accident. It was pushed into the shadows by the way history was written at the time. In the early 1900s, official records, newspapers, and survivor lists were controlled almost entirely by institutions that prioritized wealthy, white voices. If a person did not fit that image, their experience was often shortened, distorted, or excluded altogether. Joseph, as a black man of lower class, stood at the intersection of both forms of erasure. After the disaster, journalists rushed to interview prominent survivors, while testimony from marginalized individuals was considered unreliable or unimportant. Names were misspelled, reduced to initials, or omitted completely. In some cases, black survivors were recorded without personal details, making future identification nearly impossible. Over time, these incomplete records became accepted as complete history, leaving no space for Joseph's truth to exist. As decades passed, repetition turned omission into fact. Books, documentaries, and memorials repeated the same limited narratives, reinforcing the illusion that nothing was missing. It wasn't until historians began questioning these gaps, asking who was absent and why, that Joseph's story resurfaced. His disappearance reveals a deeper truth: history does not just forget people, it chooses who deserves to be remembered. The struggle to uncover Joseph's story is rooted in the racial barriers built directly into historical record keeping. In 1912, official documents, passenger lists, crew logs, inquiry transcripts, and newspaper archives were never neutral. They reflected the biases of the society that created them. Black individuals were often documented incompletely, labeled generically, or excluded altogether, making their lives far easier to erase from history. After the Titanic sank, two major investigations were launched, one in the United States and one in Britain. These inquiries relied heavily on testimony from officers, wealthy passengers, and respected officials. Voices like Joseph's were rarely invited, and when they were, their statements were often minimized or filtered through someone else's authority. Even when names appeared, they were sometimes altered, misclassified, or buried in footnotes, cutting off future historians from tracing a clear identity. These racial barriers meant that proving Joseph's existence decades later required more than simple research. It demanded reconstruction. Historians had to cross-reference scattered documents, challenge official survivor counts, and question why certain testimonies were missing. Joseph's case exposes how racism does not only harm people in life, but continues to silence them long after death by shaping what history chooses to preserve. For more than 8 decades, Joseph's connection to the Titanic existed as a troubling gap in the historical record, an absence that few questioned and even fewer attempted to investigate. From 1912 onward, Titanic history was retold again and again through books, films, and official accounts, yet Joseph's name never appeared among the familiar lists of survivors or victims. The mystery was not that evidence didn't exist, but that no one had been looking for it. The silence stretched across generations. As time passed, witnesses died, memories faded, and documents were lost or destroyed. What remained were fragments, contradictions in passenger counts, unexplained testimonies, and records that hinted at someone who did not fit the accepted narrative. These inconsistencies were dismissed as clerical errors rather than signs of a missing story. The idea that a black man's experience might have been erased was uncomfortable, and so it was ignored. It was not until roughly 83 years later, when historians and researchers began re-examining Titanic records through a more critical lens, that Joseph's story started to surface. By comparing overlooked documents, survivor statements, and racial context, a hidden truth slowly emerged. The mystery was never about whether Joseph existed. It was about why the world took so long to admit he mattered. When Joseph's story finally emerged after 83 years, it did not arrive as a single dramatic discovery, but as a quiet correction to history, one built through patience, persistence, and the willingness to challenge long-accepted narratives. Historians began asking uncomfortable questions. Why were certain names missing? Why did survivor accounts contradict official records? And most importantly, whose voices had never been invited into the story of the Titanic? Through re-examined documents, overlooked testimonies, and deeper understanding of racial bias in early 20th century record keeping, Joseph's existence was acknowledged at last. His truth reshaped the Titanic narrative, proving that the tragedy was not only about ice and steel, but about inequality, silence, and selective memory. What had once been dismissed as an error was now recognized as erasure. Joseph's story, being revealed, did more than restore one man's name. It exposed the flaws in how history is preserved. It reminded the world that truth can be delayed, but not destroyed, and that even the most documented events can still hide forgotten lives. By bringing Joseph into the light, history became more complete, more honest, and far more human.